Welcome, everybody. We're going to give everyone a few moments to join before we get started. We're going to give everybody another minute to join, and then we will get started. Welcome. I see we've got a hello from NYC in the chat. Welcome. All righty. Let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I am Adam Lush, the Regional Resource Director with Caron Treatment Centers. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar entitled Treating the Jewish Patient, Breaking the Stigma and Acknowledging Faith-Based Practices for Success in Recovery. As a reminder, we will be conducting this session in webinar format. All participant microphones will be muted and cameras will be turned off. But we would still love to hear from you and for you to interact with us. So please feel free to send your questions through the chat or the Q&A feature. We have saved time at the end to answer your questions. Depending on the volume of questions, if we can't get to your question before the end of the hour, we will have someone from our team follow up with you directly. Today's presentation is eligible for 1.5 credits through the American Psychological Association. If you're interested in receiving these credits, you must be on for the duration of the presentation. Please watch your email after the presentation for a link to complete an evaluation from cego.com. After finishing the evaluation, you will have the opportunity to download a certificate of completion immediately. Today, I am proud to introduce our presenters, starting with Reverend Jack Abel, who is the Senior Director of Spiritual Care at Caron Treatment Centers. He provides oversight for the spiritual care services on the Pennsylvania campus, where spiritual counselors and interns offer a mix of individual, psychoeducational, and more experiential group services, depending on patient needs and preferences. Reverend Jack is the principal presider for the historic Caron Chapel service, a gathering of family members, alumni, and current patients for a weekly celebration of recovery. Reverend Jack also oversees the chapel music program, which invites musician patients to share their creativity with the Caron community as a therapeutic element in their treatment experience. A popular teacher and speaker, Reverend Jack has led efforts to establish and affirm clinical spiritual care as a core component in the panel of disciplines that shape integrated clinical addiction care in the United States and around the world. He helped to design and launch Caron's unique program in clinical pastoral education, CPE, that educates chaplains in the work of addiction-related spiritual care. Also joining us today is David Rotenberg, Executive Vice President and Chief Clinical Officer for Caron Treatment Centers. He is recognized throughout the industry as an expert in treating co-occurring mental health disorders, relapse, and family issues, and innovative approaches to the intervention and treatment of teens and young adults. During his 23-year tenure at Caron, Mr. Rotenberg has pioneered treatment approaches and developed a gender-specific program that emphasizes cultural literacy as a key element in teen and young adult behavioral health treatment. Mr. Rotenberg has been the key architect of several programs on the Caron, Pennsylvania campus, including the Older Adult Program, the Collegiate Success and Sober Living Program, the Legal Professionals Program, and the Opioid Program, as well as the Executive Program. Thank you to both Reverend Jack and Dave for joining us today.
Are we on? So this is Reverend Jack Abel. I'm really excited to be a part of this. Thanks, Adam, for the introduction. And welcome to those of you who are participating live in the webinar and anybody who's watching this at a future recording time. It's a privilege and pleasure to be with you. I appreciated the biographical introduction. I'm sure my presentation style will convey a lot about me as we get into the details of it. I do want to also give a moment to my dear friend and colleague, Dave, an opportunity to say hello before we jump into what I think is some really exciting and important material we're looking forward to sharing with you.
Thank you, Jack. First off, Adam, Caitlin, thank you for hosting. Great to be with you. Audience, thank you for joining us. Reverend Jack, my friend, my brother, great to ride shotgun with you. Chief Clinical Officer is my current title. My most important title is Caron alum. And I have a long history at this beautiful organization. I'll be happy to share my own recovery story if it fits. However, more about that later. One of the other things about me, I have almost 25 years at Caron. And on June 30th, I'll have 54 years as a Jew, which is also fairly significant and important as we roll this out. So great to be with you. Back to you, Jack.
Thanks, Dave. I should mention too, I am grateful to be able to say I'm a person in long-term recovery, and I have been affiliated with the Caron organization for 13 years. So really excited to be here. Dave and I are going to attempt to co-present in a dynamic and interactive way. And you might notice the small star of David, kind of cute little sign there. Those are slides where he's being teed up to bring in some content that is directly related to his experience representing the Jewish identity and community. So, and I understand from our tech facilitators that we're going to make PDF versions of these slides available to those of you who are watching after your participation. So if you're worried and trying to feverishly take notes, we'll make them available to you. Great to have you here. This slide is just a quick overview, and I'm going to be a little more attentive to reading the content that is on these slides than I sometimes like to be, but that's because I think the slide content is tremendously useful and relevant, and it's also sparse. So everything on each of the slides, I think, has value. We're going to speak to you over the next 60-some minutes about 4 different aspects of working with Jewish clientele. And the first part is a background, which places the attention to Jewish being as part of person-centered care. The second part, which is probably in some ways the largest part, will be to provide you some help in understanding the various ways in which people understand themselves as Jewish. And then the third part will be a kind of one of my favorite things to do as a teacher and presenter is to ask the so what question. Like, what does the information that we have shared with you mean when you put it on the ground in your actual work with clients and families? And then finally, I think a very under-recognized tool is available to clinicians and mental health and medical practitioners called the CFI, Cultural Formulation Interview. And I'm going to take a few minutes if we have them at the end to make sure that people are aware of it. And it has direct bearing on not only Jewish identity, but in the contemporary landscape when I think many of us are, moved by events of the last year. Yesterday was the George Floyd anniversary. As we seek to be mindful of diversity and injustices, how do we improve our game in working with patients is the CFI could be a very helpful tool. So let's jump in. I suspect that those of you who are attending the presentation for CEUs already know what I'm about to say. And if you have worked either in a JCO or CARF accredited environment, you have been trained and encouraged to provide person-centered care. So I'm not trying to, I'm not forgetting that you probably already are aware of this, but it's useful, I think, for us to remember that these standards of person-centered care have telltale characteristics. And one of them in the red there is highlighted: respect for our clients, a quality of being directly responsive to what the client is bringing us, and seeking to move very much out of a boilerplate or one-size-fits-all approach, and instead being very specific to patient preferences, needs, and values. Those are best practices in the work that I think we all do, whether it's general mental health or use disorder care or other medical settings. We really do owe those who we are privileged to work with attention to their voice and place at the table as a clinical partnership with us. And unfortunately, in addiction care, there is an embarrassing history of something quite different from that. Treatment teams and treatment providers that have said things about patients being incapable of making their own decisions. And while there's some reasonings behind that I think are fair and important to wrestle with, motivational interviewing, which is a practice that I'm deeply committed to and appreciate very much, has shown in a very careful and evidence-based way that that more directive and kind of shame-laden approaches to communication with our clients will lead to less successful outcomes than alliances where we attend to the things that the client is willing to embrace as their own goals. And so that's what person-centered care is about. And in chaplaincy training, which we do here at Caron, and it's a big part of my work and I love doing it, one of the things that we do is train chaplains as members of clinical teams to help the other members of the clinical team pay attention to religious and cultural identity. And so there was an article which is cited in the resources at the tail end of the presentation, and there's a quote there at the bottom of the slide I'd just like to read. And this is an article about chaplaincy. It says that chaplains mapping a Jewish patient's location in the wide expanse of belief behaviors that are based in Jewish values or ritual and a sense of belonging is essential to providing appropriate spiritual care. I would say clinical care, that we can do our best clinical care with Jewish clients if we attend to those three highlighted words: belief, behavior, and belonging. And that's kind of where we're headed. So I'm just going to flip to the next slide, which is a bit of a header slide, and maybe ask my friend here, Dave, if there's anything I kind of missed. But I love this slide. I like the graphic because there's artistic and cultural hallmarks of Judaism that are pointed to on the images on the slide. And then there's these three pieces: belief, behavior, and belonging. And belonging being the largest and will be the third. We're going to address in the next several minutes of the presentation each of these aspects of Jewish identity and understanding. And I think if we were doing this in a Catholic or Hindu or Buddhist presentation, the way belief, behavior, and belonging might line up would be different than it lines up for Jewish identity. So before I run ahead, I'm just going to let Dave say something if he wants.
Beautiful, Jack. So thank you. So many different ideas and values related to the Jewish people. Jack hit it right. There's no room for boilerplate, cookie cutter, one size fits all. When you're talking about the Jewish people, trust me, you're talking about the most complex dynamics. You're talking about different levels of Judaism. You're talking about different ideas. You're talking about some believing in God, some do not. Talking about so many different variables. It behooves the clinician. If we're doing Judaism 101, it behooves you to, when you're on that section of the biopsychosocial, to dive in there when it's the section on religion. If the answer, I'm Jewish, you need to explore what that means. Okay, I think in the drug and alcohol business, historically we were, people believed an addict or an alcoholic looked a certain way, behaved a certain way, And there was a sort of a stereotypical view of an addict and an alcoholic. So too of the Jew. Didn't mean to rhyme that, it just came out that way, but it's true. People think of Jews in certain terms, and that's just not true, right? So not every Jew wears a yarmulke, dresses in all black, walks around in a steaming hot suit in the middle of August, like the Orthodox Jews might, right? You've seen them. Many, many more Jews, a large percentage, look like everyone else walking around, and you don't necessarily even know they're Jewish. Most Jews do not eat kosher. A simple example, but stereotypes for especially someone who's not culturally literate in the Jewish population, you might believe that. You might believe that everyone fits the Orthodox profile, when in fact, probably 75% of Jews do not, even larger, frankly. We'll get to a slide in a minute that shows the breakdown: Orthodox, conservative, Reform. Not every Jew has curly hair. Not every Jew is married to another Jew. Not every Jew is a practicing Jew. And not every Jew believes in God. And you say, well, that's interesting. I thought the Jews were the chosen people, and God spoke to Moses and, released them from slavery. But think about the Jews as a people. Our history as a people is one that is complex with God. And I might be jumping a slide or two, but I'll just say it now, man. I mean, look, there's Jews, Orthodox Jews believe in not only God, but the doctrine of the Old Testament, be fruitful and multiply. They're very adherent, but there's other Jews, myself included, who question God. How could we not? People who have been enslaved by history, people that have been through a Holocaust by history. Of course, in your clinical practice, then you should not assume that Jews believe in God for those reasons. But that doesn't mean they can't engage in counseling, 12-step, and a spiritual program of recovery. Back to you. We'll talk more about the other stuff later.
Yeah, super important. Everything that Dave is saying, I'm so glad that he's here with us to be able to give voice from the context of the experience of a person with Jewish heritage. And I think many of the things that he said, I come to this work as a non-Jewish person raised as a Roman Catholic kid and today ordained in the Protestant tradition, but also with a lot of study in interfaith chaplaincy. And one of the things that has been really important for me in my development as a chaplain is realizing that my education about various spiritual traditions was really quite skewed. And that, for example, I remember being taught that there were really three kinds of Jewish of belonging: Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative. It turns out that's an incomplete characterization and also a gross oversimplification. And that would be equally true if one thought that Buddhism had only its two predominant flavors, Mahayana and Theravada, or if you thought Hinduism was quite monolithic, or if you thought Christianity was very monolithic. It turns out that these wisdom traditions, which have thousands of years of practice and have developed in different contexts around the world, have elements which are deep and in common to them, and also elements of profound difference. So research is great, evidence is great. And in 2013, the Pew Research Center, which does amazing studies annually on various spiritual and cultural and religious sort of populations, has a slide where the folks that they surveyed who were Jewish identified as having no denomination, that's approximately a third, and did not identify as either Orthodox, Conservative, or Reformed, that's so 6%. So this might have been Chabad or other sort of entities, neo-Orthodox, various kinds of new labels that continue to develop and evolve. And it's really important when you're a clinician who isn't really familiar with this area, and you might see on the biopsychosocial or on an assessment or have the patient say, yeah, I grew up in a Jewish family. not to jump too quickly to a presumption that the last Jewish client that you had who educated you about their belonging and identity applies in this particular case, because that's likely a mistake. The varieties are so different. In fact, I will say as an anecdote, in training clinical chaplains around Christian belonging, this is also a very, very common mistake, is that even a Christian clinician will think, because of their worldview within their subset of the Christian landscape, that they understand their relationship with Jesus, that a Roman Catholic or a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness or a Lutheran or a Episcopal will find the resources and tools that they use in their own personal faith and practice is often a big faux pas. And interestingly, these can be deal breakers in the development and establishment of rapport with clients. So one of the underlying takeaways, and that's a slide much later, but would be humility of the practitioner. I would really urge you, if you can, to try to be cautious about thinking that even a cursory or even a deep dive that you may have in a wisdom tradition, spiritual tradition, or cultural experience makes you capable of presuming things about how that particular client is situated in that context. So it goes back to these old terrible mistakes that were made where persons of color are assumed to be, or the Latino, Latinx, Hispanic community are viewed as sort of unified communities, when in fact they're not. So really important with Jewish patients in particular to be sensitive to that, and to realize that even if you thought Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative was a useful construct and vocabulary, it's incomplete and insufficient, and may not actually capture the particular person who's in front of you. So there are lots of resources out there, and I think we benefit and suffer from the internet world in which we live. But I would say that at the end of the presentation on the slides, there are books and tools and articles, current and more dated, that can be of use. This particular book by Sylvia Fishman offers a term which I really like, which is the idea of Judaism as kaleidoscopic. And kaleidoscopes are fun, and as you twist them, they modify themselves. And when you try to approach Judaism, it's a moving target. And I'm happy to speak into it, because there are distinctions, for example, like Sephardic and Ashkenazi, which have to do with geography and Holocaust experience or non. Like there's a significant component of the Jewish community whose families and heritages were spared the Holocaust suffering. And there also is a very, very large portion of the Jewish community that is the legacy community of the direct sufferings of the Holocaust experience. And today, as clinicians, we're beginning to learn about epigenetics and multi-generational trauma. I don't know if you as the participant are yet a person who gives deep credence to those notions, but I have come to be persuaded that I think there's something really to this idea that when we are constituents of communities that have long suffered, those sufferings may be encoded and express themselves in things like diction, behavior, facial movements, responses to loud noises, a variety of things. The trauma responses that we exhibit may not be just our own from our lived experience, but may be given to us by those from whom we are born. So Jewishness is really interesting and complicated.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Jack, I'll give you guys a touch of self-disclosure. So as you know, I'm a Jew. The kaleidoscope, beautiful, and the fluidity of the Jewish patient and religion. My own experience, my father's a Holocaust survivor. And at the age of 8 and 9, he became an orphan. He lost both grandparents, both parents, and his older brother in the Holocaust in a concentration camp. And he married my mom, the kaleidoscope. My mom was Alison Grant from Scotland, not a Jew, but a Protestant. They're married, they create me. I absolutely, to Jack's point, felt the world as a dangerous place. My father, how could he not have PTSD? He's still living, by the way. He's 86. He's amazing.
Great guy.
Amazing person. Thank you. How could he not unintentionally give me the notion that the world was an unsafe place as a Holocaust survivor? So next generation trauma, anxiety for sure. And I'll talk more in slide 12, I think it is, about clinical practice and fear and anxiety. But I will tell you that it's not unfair to expect certain Jews with certain backgrounds to have a fear of the world passed on to them by prior generations based on their experiences. I was born in Philadelphia, not Romania, like my father. I had a 2-parent household. It was safe. I grew up in a leafy suburb, but the world was unsafe to me in my earliest memories. And that's part of the current landscape and kaleidoscope to keep in your mind as clinicians.
And in terms of clinical practice, when you ask a question like, what does Jewish mean to you? Then you can be listening for clues, and you might encounter labels that you didn't know about. So a Reconstructionist, renewal, or a Kabbalah Judaism, like those are terms that should elicit a curiosity in the skillful clinician, and invite, I think one of the most wonderful things that you can do with a patient or a client is to say, I don't really understand that. Will you teach me about it?
Yeah.
And it shows a humility and a willingness to be educated, and a sensitivity. This is the other thing, is that I was choked up a little bit as Dave was talking about his family. I've had the privilege of meeting his dad, and I have had the privilege of sitting with many persons who bear these kinds of testimonies to the tragedies that affected their family. And it's important to understand that the history of persecution is a component of Jewish identity. And I think it's something that's probably very hard if you're not within a community that has been persecuted or marginalized, to enter into the world of how that colors one's experience. So I'm really grateful that we spent a good chunk of time talking about the varieties of Jewish belief. And that was the first of the 3 gear wheels on our initial typological slide. And we're going to spend, this is a single slide, but that deserves a number of minutes, where we're going to talk about behavior. So instead of doctrine and systems of belief and labels that categorize communities of practice and teachings, we also have, as clinicians, to wrestle with, especially if you're working in a residential treatment center, what it means in terms of how this faith and cultural identity plays itself out in expectations of the day-to-day lived life of a person who is Jewish. And here again, the landscape is fraught with peril and mistake. So tread cautiously would be my first word to the novice clinician who, or the person who has not had a lot of Jewish patients. And I suspect there are those of you who are preaching to the choir, sorry for the Catholic metaphor, but these 5 categories are by no means exhaustive, but calendar, prayer, diet, touch, and appearance are ways in which Judaism, even for the non-religious Jew, may be important. And that's I kind of skipped a distinction that was early on in one of the slides about Jews of no religion and Jewish by religion, is a distinction that the Pew Forum found useful in its conversations and studies of large elements of the Jewish population. So that is a kind of a valid little bit of a split, and it sort of relates to this idea of do you kind of believe in God or not, or do you believe in the teachings of the tradition or not? Is there are lots of Jewish people who totally do not believe in God and do not believe in the teaching of the tradition, but will celebrate Passover.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just as true of the Christian community that celebrates Christmas and does not necessarily believe in the claims of the Christian community. So it's really, I used to describe this as Jewish by heritage. And I think that that's a legit way of thinking about it. There are people who prefer to think of themselves very strongly as Jewish by heritage. And then there are people who have a Jewish theological worldview. And sometimes you have both. You have heritage and theology. Sometimes you have theology without a lot of heritage, especially if you have a person who's converted to Judaism. But one of the things really interesting, you have a Jewish person who marries a non-Jewish person, and a non-Jewish person converts to Judaism, and maybe, sounds odd, more Jewish than the Jew they married, because in their conversion they become quite interested and become sort of like they go through this educational process and this assumption of a new tradition, and it becomes very treasured and valuable to them. I'm thinking of a particular family I know where the shiksa wife is that's a term for a non-Jewish romantic attachment of a Jewish male person. And it can be derogatory. I didn't mean it in that way, but my dear friend would laugh that I said that about her. And she's so Jewish. It's just astonishing how deeply she embraced, she converted, and it's now a rich part of her heritage. And she's the one who invited me to their Passover many years ago, and was one of my sort of teachers about all of this stuff. So holidays are, it just depends a lot on where you live. If you're in the United States, it depends so much, not only on state, but very specific community, town, and region. I grew up in an area where the Jewish holidays were acknowledged by the public school system, but many public school systems around the country do not even have on their radar at all the Jewish holidays. And instead, Easter is the big thing, Christmas is the big thing, which is very insensitive to the Jewish family. And when you add other sort of forms of belonging, it is a challenge for our public school systems to figure out how to be hospitable to the varieties of calendar and observance. But it is probably important also to stay, especially in the present moment, that there are embedded presumptions in the calendars of our school systems and our social cultural communities that reflect a strongly Christian reckoning of time. And so you may very well have a client who needs some help with that.
Yeah, great point, Jack. So, if you live in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, big city, you're liable to have a day off of school.
Yeah.
For the Jewish calendar, certainly for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Where we live, there's a very small Jewish population. Not only do they have school, but several times they've scheduled parent-teacher night in the September region of Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day of the calendar for Jews. And so there's an insensitivity, not intentional,
Right.
but again, a lack of cultural literacy. If you're going to be a clinician that's going to engage a Jewish family, you're not going to call for a urine screen on Yom Kippur. You're not going to set up an appointment on Rosh Hashanah. So know your calendar, even in the basic ways, because frankly, in non-Jewish areas, there's a real lack of sensitivity. And clinically speaking, what that does to the child and the young adult is make them feel different, less attended to, part of an out group, and really, frankly, in my case, was part of my addiction, frankly, those feelings of being out and unattended to. Back to you. So it's just significant to pay attention to calendar, you guys, as part of cultural literacy. And by the way, in the Jewish calendar, Hanukkah,
Right.
which happens right next to Christmas most years, is not terribly important. It's not as important as Christmas is to Christians, right? And so be aware of that. By far, the most important holidays for Jews are Yom Kippur,
Rosh Hashanah,
Rosh Hashanah, and Passover, not Hanukkah. So there's a 101 cultural literacy piece as it relates to calendar and holidays.
Super helpful. And again, the gaffe of many well-meaning clinicians is to talk about Hanukkah as an important way of acknowledging Jewish calendar observance, when unfortunately that's really a presumption that many have made, which is not quite accurate and helpful. So moving down, we're going to spend some time on this slide. Let's talk about prayer practices a little bit, because it has really important clinical bearing, as do the other three pieces of the puzzle. So, and I get to beat one of my preaching drums here. I appreciate deeply the way in which mindfulness practice has come to the foreground in behavioral health care. And I think that mindfulness practice is clearly of value and evidence-based, and I am wildly enthusiastic about it. In fact, I lead a daily meditation for our patients as a part of a rotation of clinicians who do daily meditations for a part of our continuum, and I did breath meditations yesterday. So I'm all about mindfulness. I also lament the way in which mindfulness has become a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter imposition and a presumption that it is a form of spiritual practice that everyone must or should do, and the implication that somehow you're not going to get well from your anxiety and your depression if you use the rosary as a Catholic or you use tefillin as a Jew, and that instead you need to learn the body scan. And so a Jewish patient who walks in the context of the clinical encounter with spiritual practice has a leg up in a way, and maybe helped more by being affirmed in their use of a prayer shawl or tefillin or other forms of regular prayer within their wisdom tradition. And a skillful and sensitive clinician would say, when you are in a lecture and learning about mindfulness, think of your prayer shawl, or think of your tefillin practice, or think of whatever are, and there are rich contemplative practices in all of the world's wisdom traditions. That term contemplative practice is, I think, a very useful one. And so as we use DBT, CBT, and ACT as methods, those are acronyms. If I suspect many of you know about them, they're great methods for mental health care and behavioral change and improvement that address very significant issues. And each of those methods bring mindfulness components to the table. Cultural sensitivity would call us in an ethical way to be flexible and adaptive, and encourage our patients and families to think about how their community has evolved forms of contemplative practice, rather than imposing something that comes largely out of a Buddhist context, unless the family has a genuine and organic sort of way in which Buddhism exists within their thought world and culture world. So I would really want practitioners, not especially with the Jewish client, to learn about Jewish prayer and ask the client, do you have forms of prayer that are within your tradition? And is there something that's meditative in your Jewish practice? Because there are tons of ways in which this aspect of spiritual practice locates itself within Jewish history, and it should be affirmed and not disregarded. That makes sense?
Very interesting too. And for me, it's interesting because I went through my entire life in Hebrew school as a young person, practicing prayer, chanting, reading Hebrew, reading it in English, but learning it in Hebrew, chanting it some more, reading it some more, practicing prayer. I never felt connected to it. It wasn't, in fact, I hated being Jewish when I was a kid. And there's significance there, everybody. Like for me, as an adolescent and a young boy growing up, I couldn't stand being a Jew. Part of that feeling of not connecting, not being part of, I was surrounded by non-Jews. I was one of 3 Jews in my class. Be in tune with that. After I went to Caron and learned recovery prayer and how to get down on my knees and pray to a higher power of my understanding. And after I went through treatment and started doing daily reflection and meditation, I actually became stronger in my prayer and later reconnected to my Judaism that way. And so Jack talked about the fluidity. Be prepared for people to not always be happy with their religion, just like any other religion. I came into treatment pissed off. I was pissed at being a Jew. I did not get along with my father. We had a ton of conflict. I hated Hebrew school. And so it was through that lens that I entered treatment. I didn't come into treatment and early recovery so pleased to be a Jew. But through the recovery process and through the treatment process, I re-engaged with prayer and a higher power and reconnected to Judaism, and the relationship with my father healed. And I gained a deeper appreciation of my religion, my people. But as a young person, I couldn't stand it. And so don't be stunned if you hear that kind of feedback when you're doing your bio and when someone's explaining how they feel about God and religion to you.
A small thought that I had when Dave was sharing was I neglected to talk about the musical aspects of Jewish contemplative practice. And so cantors, chanting, there's an unbelievably rich Jewish musical tradition, and dance also has its place in the Jewish life. And and there's a rich art heritage that I think is underappreciated, also as a place where people could go for being mindful of learning styles. And so, as you do art therapy or those kinds of things, if you have a person for whom they want to explore their Judaism, there might be clues and there are ways to encourage people to use that body of literature and music and movement as a context for healing and growth and ritual practice. So fun to realize that the contemplative life of the Jewish people, that sounds overly singular, of Jewish persons, is rich, varied, and worthy of attention as we seek to encourage people to embark on a recovery trajectory. And I think most of us in this work have come to appreciate how important community is in helping people achieve and sustain abstinence. And so, and healthy coping skills. So prayer and meditation are neuro reprogramming. They improve anxiety and those kinds of things, but they also are ways of building community. And so for all those reasons, this is great stuff, and really can be useful for you as you work with the folks who are going to come into your care. Now, yet another whole world of Jewishness to learn about, and again, a place where people make grievous mistakes, is around food. And Jewish food is really important in a lot of ways, both theological and not. So for the Jew by heritage and the Jew by theology, the teachings teach about food observance and kosherness, but also the person who could kind of care less about that still wants pastrami, like it's and lox and bagels. So there's a lot to this world, and food is rich in culture, but also has profound sacredness and meaning. And if you're in either a residential setting or even like an all-day outpatient setting where people are actually having lunch on campus or whatever, and there are people who are being dietarily observant as they enter a recovery trajectory, it can be very challenging for the facility to do this well. And then I have hilarious anecdotes of stories of family that is tremendously anxious that we have make sure that Josh, who's coming in, is going to have kosher. Josh gets here and he's more like a young Dave and is really angry. And the next thing I know, I'm in the cafeteria and I see him wolfing down a bacon cheeseburger, which violates every rule in the book. And it makes me laugh. And he doesn't want the kosher food.
No.
And he was rebelling against the imposition of his family by asking him to do it. But so maybe in a talk like this, it's probably as important for us to say that there are a lot of varieties and there's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
Kosher is a beautiful thing. And that's one of the things I really came to appreciate. A couple of years ago, I had a period of time where I had to do a deep immersion in helping a facility set up kosher accommodations, actually in New York. And I did a lot of shopping, a lot of work with a kitchen that wasn't really kosher friendly. And if you're bringing in kosher food to a non-kosher facility, I would say you need professional help to understand how to do that well. And there's special kinds of wrapping, and Dave wants to chime in.
Yeah, so right, so diet too. First of all, think about the major holidays in any religion. Jews are no exception. Food is so key, okay? From eating at Rosh Hashanah to a meal before the Yom Kippur fast,
Right.
which is the holiest day of the year, to the Passover Seder, to latkes on Hanukkah. Diet, especially kosher, Jack's right on the money. Very complex. You need a rabbi who knows what they're doing to help manage it. Here's the other piece, though. As I said in my intro, or maybe in the very beginning of this, probably 10% of Jews are actually going to be kosher coming in. Like, so Caron has 11 or 12 Jews right now on campus. Probably 1 or 2 of them actually keep kosher. The key here, though, is that we offer them a kosher selection, not always the best food in quality necessarily, but we make the effort. We have a rabbi bless the food, and we have a kosher kitchen. The notion of that is that it shows the Jewish community how much we care about getting this right, how much we care about getting it correct. You as a clinician, whether you work outpatient or inpatient, are essentially trying to do the same thing. So it's a cultural competency meets customer service meets clinical acumen kind of issue. And so if you want to be the best at what you do, which is what we strive for, you're going to tackle this issue. And so the 2 of 11 Jews that really give a shit about this, and their parents and their family members and their rabbi, are most pleased with Caron about that. And that's the idea behind it.
It is also, I guess what I would want to say is that as a novice to this, after I did my deep dive 2 years ago, I did not realize how much meaning and how much beauty in some ways there is for the person who does keep kosher. It is a treasured, cherished, and really valued observance. And so for the person for whom it is important and the family for whom it's important, it is sacred important, not just perfunctory or obligatory in another sense. And there are deep convictions about cleanliness and health and wellness that attach to keeping kosher. And so if we in any way as a facility are dismissive or minimizing about the sacredness or the significance, it can again be a very damaging element in the clinical rapport. So as you can see, as we walk our way into this, not only is the belief landscape quite complex and interesting and kaleidoscopic, but then the behavioral landscape is also quite complex and kaleidoscopic. And diet is so important to the small subset, but to the small subset to whom it's important is tremendously important. And then to the larger majority of persons who identify as Jewish, there are nominal pieces of diet that can be tremendously helpful. So the matzah Passover accommodations and a Seder plate can show an incredible amount of effort and sensitivity, which will make a huge amount of difference to a person who is wanting to know that they're seen and that they're appreciated and understood and welcomed, especially if there's a history underlying that and a fear of not being understood. So this is where patient-centered is so important. I think I want to move to the next piece of the 5-piece behavior puzzle here. So, and when I talk about touch, it's both really important to say that this could be relevant and to say in the large majority of Jewish clients, this not necessarily apply. So where touch becomes tremendously important is if you have a subset of patients who identify as Orthodox or conservative, but highly observant. And when I use the word observant, just to be technical for a moment, in the Hebrew scriptures, there are a series of instructions, mitzvahs, 613 of them, and which is a gauntlet that's almost impossible to adhere to. Some of it is impossible to adhere to in the sense that it's anchored in the context and time and has to do with calendar that no longer applies. And some of it because it's as if the edicts are somewhat contradictory. So you should, and a good example is if you have a person who is sick on the Sabbath, do you do a life-saving intervention that puts them in a car and takes them to the hospital? Yes, you do, because you're not supposed to drive, but the life-saving, and this is, the term for this is midrash, which is the negotiation of conflict when one rule and another appear to be in tension. And most Jewish persons who seek to be observant would ask a rabbi to weigh in on a midrash when there's a conflict of teaching. And so that's one of the things that we do and we teach our chaplains to do, is to consult either with our own consulting rabbi, we have a couple of them in our different sites, or to consult with the family's rabbi and ask them to help tell the patient what they can and can't do. And we do not impose practices. So we have patients who come in who, and specifically on the matter of touch, what this looks like, and this beautiful notion of negia, which many people outside of the world think of as having notes of misogyny or really being disrespectful of women, but a Orthodox Jew would tell you that their understanding of it is it has to do with respect and sensitivity and sacredness and preciousness. So these are, I'm not going to arbitrate those debates. I think this is a complex place, but what happens is that we have families who come in here, and we have female patients who come in here who would believe that the only touch they should share is within intimate members of their own family. And so if I walk in and I put my hand out, hi, I'm Reverend Jack, I'm actually crossing a boundary before I even have touched the person. By inviting the touch, I'm out of code with the behavior and initiating an awkwardness that the female patient, because she knows I'm a spiritual care person, may feel obliged to break her code. It's just tremendously tricky, and COVID has been helpful in making us much more socially distanced, but you have certain people around whom touch is an issue.
Think about our culture, the treatment industry, the 12-step culture, the recovering culture. You hug, you shake hands at greeting, you hold hands when you do a prayer at the end of a meeting. You might hug like this at the end of another type of meeting. For this population, which Jack is describing, the Orthodox community, which is, again, it's going to be maybe 15% of the Jews you might meet, you have to be in tune with this. So you might be better off, for instance, if it's a male patient, assigning them a male counselor. You can't always do stuff like that, but it's helpful if you can. You're not shaking hands upon admission. You're certainly not hugging them out when they leave. And so, again, sensitivity to this 15% most conservative group of Jews, the same people that are likely to be sticking to the kosher diet, by the way.
Right.
very complex and probably need the deepest dive to understand all the laws and regulations, the Orthodox.
And none of us has to become expert in it, because the truth is it's a very complicated landscape. And then you have the bacon cheeseburger fellow. So who is enacting a kind of rebellion, but may very well appreciate that the institution is not forcing him or her to step outside the boundary, and may choose to step outside the boundary in their own examination of what's going on internally. So really good. The last of our behavioral points, and really, I think appropriate and interesting and not to be overlooked, has to do with appearance. And this is certainly perhaps most important with the small subset that are Orthodox, but a yarmulke or kippah, the head covering for a male, is something that if you have a wisdom about it, especially if you have any kind of religious observance, or especially like just a story. We have in non-COVID periods, we have Shabbos observance. So this is Sabbath from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset weekly, for offered to our Jewish community on campus. And this is an intermixing of different milieus because it's a small number of people. So one of the interesting things about calendar is that the Jewish day begins at sunset and ends at sunset the following day, rather than a sort of contemporary non-Jewish ideas that day starts at sunrise and ends at sunset kind of thing. But no, the day begins at sunset. And this happens with all. So we like, when is Passover? Well, Passover begins on the sunset of the day. And when this Passover ends, it ends on the sunset of the next day. And it's that moment of astronomical timing that becomes really important. And so if your dinner is always at 7:30, how that intersects with the sun's movement at a particular time of year is something that you end up having to attend to. But I was telling the Shabbos story. So we had a rabbi facilitating Shabbos observance, and we had staff going to the Shabbos observance to supervise mixed gender young patients to avoid obvious behavioral concerns. And we had staff who were invited by the rabbi to wear a yarmulke or kippah because it was customary. And this was very sensitive from a HR perspective. I've had many patients read in our chapel service, Jewish patients read Jewish texts. And I always have a yarmulke there because 1 out of 4 of them will wear the yarmulke, the males who want to read. So, and many of those who do want to wear it are not Orthodox. They're not necessarily, they're just wearing it because it's donning the identity. It's a moment of inhabiting one's Jewishness. And to have it be respected and understood and appreciated and welcomed, or a tallit, a prayer shawl, is another piece of appearance that may, and as you move into the small subset that are Orthodox, you have a lot more things to address: women and hair. There's some very particular practices and teachings that one should be sensitive about, just to understand. And modesty is an inherent element of the more observant the Jewish person becomes. In a certain sense, modesty becomes tremendously important. So when you look at the black suits or the wigs and those sorts of things, what's underlying that as a value is a value of modesty, and not a value of, in any way, of oppression or self disrespect or those kinds of things. It's important to realize that there's something beautiful meant by these practices and observances.
Beautiful, yeah, beautiful. I do not wear a yarmulke. Frankly, I respect Jews that choose to. I've seen, by the way, boys in the cafeteria eating a cheeseburger and wearing their yarmulke
Right.
at the same time, man. Just so I would throw that in there. Frankly, I like wearing a yarmulke in the actual active practice of being in the synagogue, being at a bar mitzvah, being at Sabbath service with my father. But frankly, I'm not walking around the world with a yarmulke.
Right.
Because I don't necessarily feel safe or want everyone to know I'm a Jew. I'm proud of it, but at the same time, that doesn't sit well with me. And frankly, for safety purposes, as sad as that is. I remember walking around Jerusalem with my father. He had a yarmulke on, and I was like, you know what, man, there's just as many people that would like the destruction of Israel, Jerusalem, as they would the nurturing of it. I'm not okay and comfortable wearing it. I'm also not an Orthodox Jew, so I choose not to.
Helpful and important testimony. Thanks, Dave. I flipped us ahead to the third slide. Remember, in the gears, we had belief, behavior, and belonging. And the Jewish Community Foundation, in a document that they have, identify a culture of belonging as essential to Jewish identity. And in some of the chaplain training materials, this quote is worth reading. Christian chaplains who tend to think of belief as the primary indicator of religiousness will do well to become familiar with the overarching importance of belonging rather than belief in the Jewish community. I think that's a really powerful statement, especially for those of us who might be outside of the Jewish tradition and kind of think of Judaism more in the notion of belief or behavior, when in fact belonging, if you hear the way Dave is talking, he references my people, and this idea, it's an issue of identity and membership and constituency, as much as it is for some also then teachings or behaviors. There's something about it, and I think befriending that is the wise path for the clinician who wants to develop the most deep alliance, rather than ignoring it or even perhaps suppressing it or seeking to force belonging. There's JACS, JACS, which is an organization that fosters belonging in support of families around recovery. So that would be one takeaway I would hope people would have from a training like this, is to understand that belonging is quite primary, and that the belief and behavior pieces, while important and contributing to sensitivity, when a person says they're Jewish, they're telling you something on this domain, if not on the other two. Like it may be a painful element of belonging, but it's almost like I'm Jewish could be apologetic rather, or like a frightful disclosure.
Mm-hmm.
It may be an inherited piece that one feels a certain kind of I hate to say it, but a shame about. And it is so about belonging that I think that's one of the things that maybe distinguishes Jewish identity for me in my work with a variety of people with different wisdom traditions. And I'm not saying that belonging is not important in other folds. I think it is important in many other folds, but we're talking about treating Jewish patients and just inviting you to really be mindful that that's a way of thinking about it that can be very helpful and shows a kind of beginning of a literacy that may be very meaningful for your client to recognize that you hold. And I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm watching our time. We have a bunch of more content to throw at you. I'd like to kind of jump through it quickly. So, and then we'd like to get to some questions. So if I can speak about this slide, and Ari Goldman wrote a book, just a fantastically interesting book for the non-Jewish person, called The Search for God at Harvard Divinity. Really amusing, easy read. A journalist, but and scholar and an Orthodox Jew. This text, also about the spiritual and cultural practice of Judaism today, is a kind of a survey, not unlike the one that was on the kaleidoscope slide. So there are references and resources that you can, if you're going to have a lot of Jewish clients, you might want to do some study. a couple of things from a theological and cultural reference. You may see the G_D thing and not know what it is. That is a contemporary inclusive spiritual practice that actually many non-Jewish theologians have adopted, but it comes out of a Jewish thing where the name of the divine is something one approaches with humility, respect, and a kind of a tacit silence. Even writing the 4 characters of the Hebrew characters, which signify the name of God, is done reverently and cautiously, and saying that name aloud is thought of as perhaps a little bit too much hubris. So this idea that being respectful and not naming God's name out loud is part of appreciating God's sacredness and magnificence and magnitude. We already touched earlier about the remembrance of persecution, but I don't think we could have done any better than having Dave here, bearing witness to his family and personal experience. You brought that in such a concrete way that was very. We talked about practices and identity being sensitively tied, even for the non-religious Jew. That Passover and Sabbath may be very important. Lighting candles becomes a tricky issue because candle lighting often given accorded to women within the community as a way of women having a significant role, which is awesome. But on our facility, we can't light candles. We use electric Sabbath candles. So we have electric Sabbath candles here. And there are creative solutions for accommodating Jewish patients that do communicate to your patients and families that you are trying, and they're worth doing that. And then I think that last bullet about a legalistic and act consequence heritage, that this Old Testament theology that Dave referenced, and even calling the Old Testament, by the way, is a Christian formulation and has a pejorative note to it. So that's why I say Hebrew scriptures, is that the language we use communicates in subtle ways, sometimes things that we don't mean to imply, but it is an old writing, so it's legit to call it old. But the Old Testament label is usually in contrast to a New Testament that's thought of somehow as fresher and better, which is the implication we would not want to send. So we've tried to give you an overview of how belief, behavior, and belonging are this provocatively complex and sensitive way in which Jewish diversity presents itself within your clinical setting. And I hope it's been helpful. And I want to ask Dave, who, by the way, I would tell you, I have come to appreciate as a master clinician. I think he's been one of my great mentors. And so I asked Dave to talk to us a little bit about, like, what does this really mean and what does he want to know? And I'm going to ask for a couple minutes before we get to the 45 minutes just to talk about the CFI. But
Awesome.
Give us some takeaways.
First off, Brother Jack, wonderful facilitation of a very complex topic and people. Trust me, the most complex people. Funny story about the Sabbath and candles. 15 years ago, we used to be looser, like every other treatment center. And a kid knew that his mom and dad would bring 3 things: challah for the blessing over the bread, candles, and third, a bottle of wine.
Right.
So this kid slides into his parents' room, which was on campus over the Sabbath, steals the bottle of wine, chugs it, and obviously passes out, ruins the Sabbath. Anyway, listen, we covered so much ground, and I know there's going to be Q&A. I know that, but think about the complexity of Jewish life, and think about how many major holidays and the Sabbath, by the way, include wine as a given in our culture. When I think about the Jewish people, I explained why the world, the persecution, the Holocaust, slavery thousands of years ago, the Jewish people, my people, have never had a comfortable spot to call home. Even Israel, which is home to half the Jews in the world, is constantly under attack or has to be on guard and vigilant because they might be under attack at any moment. And so the Jews have had this, so I dove in and did a quick lit review, is my point. I was certain that Jews were going to have higher rates of PTSD, anxiety, and depression versus the general public. And what I actually found, which is significant for your practice and ours, Jews have lower rates. So Jews historically weren't thought of as people of alcoholism or of substance use disorder. Jews and Asians were by history considered the lowest by far in that domain. And in fact, now Jews have caught up. They're not all the way up, but in substance use disorder, 11% is the number for Jews versus 15 to 18 for the general public. So we as a people are catching up. Mood disorder, depression, and dysthymia, we have higher rates of that, and we have higher rates of some simple phobias, which makes sense. But we do not have overall rates of higher other psychiatric issues. I thought that was important to note. Also, like I said earlier, not everyone loves the notion of being Jewish. In fact, I suspect the younger your patient, the more pissed off they're going to be about Judaism, authority figures in general, perhaps the notion of God, etc. Then you have to understand the family history. Does it include the Holocaust? Is there secondary trauma? There's notions like that. One person or several of you asked about 12 steps and Christianity. Is it safe or appropriate for Jews? Of course it is. Of course it is. In fact, the notion of a higher power is significant for Jews. The notion of community and sense of purpose is significant to Jews. Steps 4 through 10, which is talking about personal inventory and atonement of sins and doing better going forward. The entire notion of Yom Kippur, the most holy day on the Jewish calendar, is atoning for one's sins and trying to find a clean slate for the coming year, and fasting and praying. And so the intersection and the ability to intertwine 12-step principles and Judaism is very strong and very significant. Frankly, in my opinion, as a clinician of 30 years and as a Jew, someone who says I can't do 12 steps because it's too Christian is really just obstructionist and in denial, and really just finding an excuse to not do 12-step meetings.
Or not well informed.
And so I don't expect a clinician who doesn't have a rapport with a Jew or who's not as well versed to come out that way. But I might say something like that to a fellow Jew, so just be cautious, as Jack has noted throughout this. You can't necessarily say that, but you can understand that. So 12 steps not only is safe for Jews, but should be encouraged for the Jewish people. I could go on and on. I will just say that when I went to treatment at the age of 23, I was the only Jew in a treatment center. And the person that got through to me at that moment was a guy named Father Bill, who was a mentor to both of us. A Jew does not need another Jew to carry a message of recovery or to instill hope or to find their spirituality. Brother Jack, Reverend Jack, as was said, or as Adam said earlier, runs the greatest non-denominational spiritual program in the industry and anywhere around. And I can tell you that the Jews at Caron that attend this thing, and by history, Father Bill's before Jack, get so much out of it. And so it's possible that a kid like me, who's a pissed off Jew and estranged from his father, might find a spiritual reckoning and home at a place that doesn't, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a rabbinical student or a rabbi to make it happen. That stuff is absolutely possible. That's the power of a good treatment center. That's the magic of a life of recovery. Bam.
So that was awesome. One last thing, and let me just flip quickly to it. I'll show you 3 slides in rapid succession. The DSM, which is something I suspect all of you know about, at the back of the tome has an appendix on a tool called the cultural formulation interview, CFI. And it's a 16-question instrument that's meant to help clinicians explore the intersection of culture with patient care. And for those of you who want to develop skills, it's actually worthy of study, and the DSM calls for facilities and practitioners to experiment with the CFI. And of course, the DSM-5 is old enough now that it's been out there, and there have been a lot of work done with the CFI tool. It has a notion of culture that is useful and interesting. I think it's fairly commonsensical. It actually is a structured interview. So I'm not a big fan of structured interviews, but some of you may be. And if you want help figuring out how to do a cultural interview, the CFI is a good one. It's and you can read it and borrow from it. Let me just show you what I think is the most apropos question, which is the 8th of the 16 questions, which is right here. And I'm just going to read the prompt aloud because it just shows, it's kind of, it's great. So it presumes that in the first few questions, you've identified the patient defining their problem within their context. So they might talk about, for example, in an extreme case, addiction is demonic possession, right? So I'm possessed by an evil force. So I'm going to use that as an example just because it's kind of hyperbolic, but useful. So when I get to question 8, I would say sometimes aspects of people's background identity can make their understanding of this possession better or worse. By background or identity, I mean communities you belong to, languages you speak, where you are from, your race or ethnic background, your gender or sexual orientation, or faith or religion. What of those is especially important to you in understanding your background or identity? This is a kind of question the CFI can teach a clinician to bring cultural inquisitiveness to the encounter. And I wish more clinicians would be more culturally inquisitive. One of my dear friends who used to work with us, I can tell you, Dave, who I'm talking about afterwards, and who's now gone on to another facility of great reputation, was a deeply religious person himself, but told me as a trained psychotherapist, he was cautioned in his training to step away from these things. And he was envious of me because I was Reverend Jack and I could dive into these questions. I think that's shifting. I think there's a very big shift in the tide of clinical practice. And I think that clinical practice is becoming more culturally sensitive and culturally aware, which I celebrate. And I invite us all, especially in the current moment, to seek to become more skilled in asking and listening to these aspects of the context in which the ailments our patients suffer from are emerging, because it will enrich your understanding, deepen your rapport, and provide you new interventions and insights that may help your folks not only get well in the short term, but sustain their recovery in the long term. So I think that's where we're going to move to a Q&A. And
thank you.
Adam,
Yeah,
your help.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Reverend Jack and Dave, for that marvelous presentation. We will now move on to answering your questions, starting with those submitted through the registration process, and then moving to the great questions that have come through the Q&A and chat. So first off, I'm going to kind of sorting through and combining some of these questions. What can clinicians in an inpatient setting particularly do, and maybe discuss some of the things that we do at Caron to provide a really safe environment for Jewish patients? And I'm combining it with another question that said, would you discuss ongoing assessments and interventions of anti-Semitism and other isms within the patient and staff community? So how do we address, or what are best practices regarding addressing intolerance in the community?
That is like such a good question. And I have to tell you, first of all, in our setting in Pennsylvania, we have approximately 200 beds. We have well over, we have a significant occupancy, a very diverse population, ages 13 to 85, and mixed gender, and also very diverse educational and professional backgrounds. And issues of anti-Semitism, I am sad to say, have arisen on a relatively almost, I'm not gonna say routine. I think we're really good at this, but part of it, that was a brilliant question. Part of the sensitivity is caring for milieus and communities where this surfaces as a hostile dynamic, as well as in hospitality. And I think we've oriented our entire presentation towards hospitality. But the other thing, we have we act swiftly and directly, and I hope a clinically sophisticated way to approach any indication of insensitivity. So, and that begins with a one-on-one interview. And then it may very well be with some sort of reparative or restorative process. But we never want to just throw people out,
No.
but we also, if need be, will shepherd somebody into another setting of care if that's, and we try really hard not to like say, that's it, you're out. Because unfortunately, as a trauma-informed provider, what we do understand is that usually the mirror image side of this is a recognition of somebody's woundedness as well. That's what I would say.
If I could add, you know what, I can't add more to the patient experience. What I will say as a professional clinician of 30 years now, Adam and questioner, I have come across anti-Semitism as a counselor and a clinical leader from the patient population. I am not throwing that person out for being anti-Semitic. I am protecting other Jews in the community, but I am able to separate as a clinician, having difficulty tolerating the person's belief system, but still as a professional, reminding myself that I have an obligation to treat him or her.
And to love them.
That's exactly right. I don't have to love their notions or love their ideas, but as a professional clinician who happens to be a Jew and a leader, I have the ability to throw people out of treatment, but that's simply not how I'm going to operate. And that's frankly not a professional angle of operation. Next question.
I guess to piggyback off of that prior question, are there things we do physically on campus? And forgive me if I pronounce this incorrectly, but such as putting mezuzahs on office doors or anything like that, where patients can maybe more easily identify clinicians or supports?
Sure. Actually, it's a great question. And what I'm happy to say is that we have a very generic environment. We do not put crucifixes up, and we do not put mezuzahs up, and we do not put, but we make individual accommodations for patients, whatever their cultural location.
Correct.
So we allow people, and in fact, one of the things I have is I have an app that will point to the direction of Mecca. And so I can go into a Muslim patient's room and help them figure out how to align their prayer shawl so that we make accommodations for them for the times of day when they want to pray. But we would not adorn the clinical environment with symbols that might either offend in an attempt to be hospitable. It's a generic environment.
That's great. All righty. Do people of the Jewish faith generally want to talk in therapy directly through the lens of their culture and religion?
That's a tough one, Adam and team. I mean, listen, so the answer is maybe. Like for a decent percentage, yeah, they're going to want to come in. An Orthodox Jew is absolutely going to want to talk through that lens. Someone like me who entered treatment, no. And in fact, 75% of Jews coming into treatment or more, 80, are not going to be Orthodox. They're going to incorporate their history, what it was like as a child. I told you some of my own experience, how I was impacted, but no, you're not necessarily coming into treatment through that lens. And that's why an accurate open dialogue in the bio, and as I'm getting to know you, is really key. Educate me on where you're coming from. I might not want anything to do with Judaism. I might not. We have a rabbi who will see every Jewish patient on this campus. A decent percentage say no, thank you.
Right.
I don't want to see the guy. That's not why I'm here.
And
Others,
they'd rather see the chaplain.
they'd rather see Jack or Father Bill before him. That's exactly right. And other Jews will demand kosher food and convincing by a rabbi that caron is the right place for them, pre-admission. And so it's across the spectrum, Adam and audience, that particular issue. Again, not to be corny, but that's why it's individualized treatment. You have to dive in and figure that out as the clinician for each one of your patients, and including Orthodox Jews. There are many Orthodox Jews that come here, especially the younger ones again, who also want to distance themselves from God, authority figures, the Orthodox rabbi, and the lens of Judaism.
Some of the most complex and precious encounters that you just made me think of have been gay Orthodox Jew patients. And that's an irreconcilable sort of identity conflict, but it's been something that's been very tender and really important and meaningful. And we've had some extraordinary case study instances where those conflicts have been in play. So I do think it's not an answer. The question confesses a desire to have a kind of a singular understanding, and I hope the whole presentation has been oriented towards recognizing that having singular understandings and approaches is dangerous with Jewish populations.
Thank you.
Coming, Adam.
Thank you. I'd like to ask personally, Reverend Jack, if you could elaborate a little bit on the structure of our spiritual support team and how it integrates with our treatment process as an example of, a best practice.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite preaching points. And in our last couple of minutes, one of the things that I've appreciated, and Dave deserves a great shout out for being a champion of this also as one of our executive team, is that the caron organization has made a commitment to having professional chaplaincy as an integrated discipline within the clinical environment. And while we do contract with rabbinical services, and we also have contracted with Catholic priests to come on and do some confessions, neither the rabbis nor the Catholic priests are our chaplain team. Our chaplain team are people who bring the kind of rich, rounded education that I hope I have evidenced in my presentation here, and who have been very cautiously trained to not have their own faith tradition even be particularly visible to a patient. It's really important to help, and this is in hospital chaplaincy, hospice chaplaincy, and military chaplaincy, well-established traditions of how chaplaincy can be done and best practices. And we are developing best practice training for chaplains in this setting. And we have embedded chaplains who participate in treatment team meetings and actually educate the treatment teams in cultural sensitivity. And we think it improves our excellence in care, helps build rapport, and it can be a great ASA intervention as well against staff advice departure. So oftentimes the chaplain is a court of last resort before the person heads down the hill, because we come from a very different sort of perspective. And so we're happy. I'm really happy to lead a team of chaplains and have chaplain interns on campus, as well as our professional full-time chaplains here, and would encourage treatment centers who are interested in that and treatment providers to contact me if you'd like to know more about how that's done.
Best in the business, Jack Abel, but also Karen's whole spiritual program. Honestly, Adam, without marketing too much at Caron, while other treatment centers are decreasing or not thinking about positioning spiritual and pastoral care, we're front and center with Professor Emeritus of Chaplaincy in the United States, by the way, and with a thriving team of 5 and 6, and if you include the interns, 7 and 8 in chaplains. And that speaks to how important topics of this notion and this type are. and the sensitivity and the care that we put towards them.
Thank you both again. And with that, we're coming to the hour. So a few final items to wrap up. I just would also like to thank again, excuse me here. Thank Reverend Jack and Dave for sharing their expertise, and to all of the attendees who joined us today. As a reminder, we are offering 1.5 APA credits for today's presentation. So please keep an eye on your email for a personalized link to the evaluation from cego.com. We hope you will join us again in June for another continuing education webinar. On Wednesday, June 16th at noon, we will be addressing the topic of treating trauma and PTSD in older adults, uncovering and healing a lifetime of experiences. This presentation is complimentary and will offer 1 continuing education credit hour for professionals. Registration is now open, and you can please visit www.caron.org/webinars for more details to sign up, as well as to stay posted on our upcoming program offerings. And finally, please reach out to your local regional resource director at any time for additional information or resources in your area or questions regarding admissions to any of Karen's programs. Thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
I'll be back in 10 seconds.